Why are they going to the certain countries that they're going to? So why did Wang Yi choose Chad, Congo, and Nigeria and Namibia? We can assign all sorts of different strategic reasons. Namibia has uranium. Nigeria has this incredibly important market and this geopolitical relationship. Chad is part of the Sahel amid declining French influence. We can assign all of those reasons, but at the end of the day, I mean, we have to be painfully honest, we have no idea. We have no insight whatsoever as to what motivates them to go to these countries.
Forget about messaging. You have to look at action. This is 101 in politics. It doesn't matter what the person says. What matters at the end of the day is what is being done on the ground. And if we contrast that from, say, maybe an infrastructure perspective, there is a lot of talk on infrastructure from the Western country with PGI, with Global Gateway, and not much action. But there have been action on areas where there's core strategic interest for the West. For instance, in digital technologies and subsea cables, in critical mineral supply chain, they're moving really, really fast. So, but that is just how it is because that aligns with interest. So forget about what you're hearing, judge your interests, try to get a clear understanding of your counterpart's interests. Where there's an alignment, you'll find out that you can move things faster. It doesn't matter what Trump says, it's what he's really going to do at the end of the day. I think that's what is really important.
I think with all due respect to the Democrats in the US, this is Joe Biden's making. The coddling of Israel's actions in Gaza and the way that has been, like in rhetoric, has been completely, has not been put into the same context as Russia's actions in Ukraine, has created this kind of split in the language of the liberal international system, which has significantly weakened it. And I think where we are now is this kind of saying the quiet part out loud kind of situation, kind of where suddenly it's okay to talk in these very explicitly imperialist terms. I mean, what's going to be very interesting is to see how the Global South responds and, kind of how, what kind of measures they could take. Because Global South is weak, but they have power in their own ways, so this is going to be very interesting.
The China in Africa podcast is supported in part by our subscribers and Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join a global community of readers for daily news and exclusive analysis about Chinese engagement in Asia, Africa, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Géraud from the beautiful island of Mauritius, and CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to both of you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Good afternoon.
We've got a very busy show today, talking about Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's annual visit to Africa that always begins in January, in the beginning of the year. This is the first overseas visit by the Chinese foreign minister for the past 35 years. It's a really important part of the travel itinerary of the Chinese foreign minister every year. We should make a little bit of an asterisk, though, that the foreign minister doesn't make Africa the first stop because there's always a stopover somewhere. And this year it was in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So a couple of the analysts on X were nitpicking, saying it's not the first place that he goes to, it's the second place that he goes to. Fair enough. That's a little bit of a detail. I think they're splitting hairs on that. So he did stop in Colombo, Sri Lanka for a few hours on his way to Namibia, the Republic of Congo, Chad, and then he finished up the tour in Nigeria. Géraud, let's start with you. Give us your very quick headline of this past week. What stood out for you in this tour of Africa and the 4 countries that he went to?
I think the thing that stood out for me was basically the narrative that we had since last year, a couple of years back, where we've been trying to understand the meaning behind these trips and trying to understand the selection of these countries, why they picked this country, why this country. I think it was really that frenzy where experts and editorialists were really trying to make sense of what's to make of those trips. And I've made a column where I say it was much more about diplomacy. And for me, it was the fact that this trip is like 35 years into making irregularity a consistency that we haven't seen in nowhere in the world in Africa relationship, diplomatic Africa relationship with any other countries. So having China doing that and maintaining that 35 years old tradition, for me, it's something that's really much of importance, despite the fact that we may or may not have big announcement or big statement to come out of those trips. But just to maintain that regularity, for me, it was the big headlines of these trips. And I think we should also, at some point, with looking into how China is moving away from the big financing infrastructure in Africa, we should start really to appreciate that diplomacy is also the bread and butter of relationship between countries, and having those kind of trips really maintain the relationship that China has with many African countries.
Cobus, Géraud points out that there were no big announcements. We'll get into one railway loan announcement in Nigeria. We'll get into that later. But for the most part, this trip did not make a lot of news. It seems like that was maybe the intention.
Yes, I think in general, it seemed really focused on showing China's predictability. That I think particularly because everyone is kind of fixated on Donald Trump returning as president and his general kind of like changeability. I think China was presenting the opposite, essentially. They were like saying like, look, China's going to be showing up in the same way as it has for 29 years on schedule. So there's that. I was also struck by the continuation, maybe because I'm just obsessed with talking points, but like, the continuation of particular kind of talking points from FOCAC in these visits. Like all was very explicitly put as an implementation of FOCAC commitments. And so they made that link very clear, but then also like a lot of the language around like helping African countries modernize in their own particular ways, for example, was really replicated from FOCAC. So it was a very interesting kind of like example of how stable Chinese discourse is in Africa, particularly compared to the US, which is really kind of going through a lot of changes at the moment.
But just to be clear here, there are a lot of talk about FOCAC, a lot of talk about the stability in the relationship, but very few details at all came out of any of the stops. So we don't really know what he talked about with the various leaders in Namibia, Chad, and Congo and Nigeria. So that is unfortunate that, again, we just don't have a lot of visibility into the FOCAC process in terms of what was promised, what's being delivered, and what's being executed on now leading up to the next FOCAC that incidentally will take place in Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo, which is one of the stops that Wang Yi went on this week's tour. Well, let's get a perspective now on the trip from one of the sharpest guys out there who follows Africa-China relations. Ovigwe Eguegu is a longtime friend of the show. He's been on the program for many years. He's a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, and he joins us from Abuja, Nigeria. The last stop on Wang Yi's tour was in Nigeria. Ovigwe, good afternoon. Welcome back to the show. Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be back. I'm looking forward to having a very exciting conversation about the trip because, like Cobus and Géraud have said several things about the trip. My perspective, first of all, yes, there's the continuation of the tradition, and that symbolism is very, very important. Of course, we know that in China-Africa relations, also the of importance is the issue of substance, right? And for many years, these trips have been seen as a way to get a sense of what the rest of the year is going to be like in terms of China-Africa engagement, why certain countries are prioritized. This time, I think if you look at the overall picture, what Eric just said now about not knowing a lot of the substance from each of the stops, I think that's something we'll maybe start to get used to going forward, in the sense that when you are in an environment with so much geopolitical anxiety, there's a lot of attention on the relationship, and likely to increase given what is even happening with changes in administration in Washington. There will be we would see a lot of things being done very quietly, trying to make sure nothing rocks the boat. And at the same time, there will be those maybe one or two big announcements that will be coming out, just like we've heard for Nigeria.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that Nigeria announcement shortly when we kind of walk through what were some of the highlights of each point on the trip. Ovigwe, you talk about the geopolitical context, and I think that's a good place for us to start our conversation today, in part because while Wang Yi was traveling across Africa, there was a lot going on elsewhere around the world and focused on Africa. And I think it's important to put this as part of the context to kind of compare and contrast China's approach to Africa versus those of some of the other major powers. A lot of controversy this week from French President Emmanuel Macron, who issued a very controversial speech. Some people were saying he was just speaking in his normal off-the-cuff way. Some people were saying it was intentional, but he caused a lot of anger in France's former colonies in Africa when he said that these countries should thank France for its longtime military support, its military presence, and other people have different words for it. Let's take a listen now to French President Emmanuel Macron and his controversial remarks.
We
had a secure relationship. In truth, it was in two parts. One part was our commitment to fighting terrorism since 2013. We were right. I think some have forgotten to say thank you, but that's okay. It'll come in time. I'm in a good position to know that ingratitude is a disease that cannot be transmitted to humans. But I say this for all the African governments who've not had the courage in the face of public opinion to bear it, that none of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region.
Oh, my goodness. Géraud, you are ungrateful, apparently. And, by the way, Ovigwe, you apparently are ungrateful. Cobus, I don't know if you fall into the realm of this, but all of you seem to be ungrateful for the lack of appreciation that you have given to the French government for all that they've done for Africa over the past 4 centuries. Géraud, we'll start with you as a Francophone resident in Africa. Tell us a little bit about what the hell do you think he was trying to say and what the response was. And then Ovigwe, I'd love for you to weigh in.
Me before even without trying to defend anything that he said, but when you hear what he said, he's talking about the fact that African leaders did not tell the truth to the population about French military presence in the countries. Like when he said that, we are the ones who helped those African countries to maintain independence toward the Sahel region, toward what was happening with the terrorism that's happening in the Sahel. And of course, this kind of comment it was not really appreciated by social medias and Africans and everybody in terms of the way it was presented, especially since the criticism against French presence in those countries is not really about only the recent time against the terrorism. It's really comes from what was coming after the colonization process, the French military presence remained in those countries, how they ousted coup, how they supported military coup, how they protected dictators and everything. That was all of it together. And when people heard him talking, I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean about everything that happened? And plus, when he talks about terrorism, people have in mind what's happening in Libya, because the situation in the Sahel is very much a consequence of what happened in Libya and how France really pushed to house Gaddafi and how that situation in Gaddafi in Libya unraveled in the Sahel region, creating all this terrorism that we see in those regions. So him talking, I'm the one who helped, France is the one who helped you to maintain your independence against the terrorism that you helped create it to happen, was just something that was just out of touch, out of line, tone deaf, as one of the French politicians says. Emmanuel Macron just tone deaf about what's happening in Africa and how France is perceived in Africa. And I think that was really, really something more than clumsy. It was just stupid at some point.
Yeah. And in Senegal, Ovigwe, the response was particularly passionate. When you heard those remarks, what was your reaction?
It's quite an interesting remark in the sense that not only is it about paternalism and that attitude that Emmanuel Macron himself has displayed and the contemptuous statement, but let's even go back to look at exactly what he's saying before we go to Senegal. If you remember, when the French launched Operation Sahel, this was 2013, early 2013, 2012, they were planned 2013, because you had the CMA and the jihadists, they've taken Timbuktu, they were going to Bamako, and there was a lot of apprehension that Mali was going to fracture. Then the French president, François Hollande, launched Operation Sahel, and the troops were about 30,700. They were very effective, actually. They were very effective in pushing back the rebels. And in February 3rd, I can't forget that he visited Timbuktu, but landed in Bamako, they went to Timbuktu. When he arrived in Bamako, the people of Mali were screaming, "Vive la France! Vive François Hollande!" So in a way, Macron is actually wrong if we are going by his logic, or let's take what he's saying, because there was a lot of gratitude from the Malian population, and that is well documented. Where Macron is really, 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 really wrong is, or at least even worse, is then saying, looking at the totality of French involvement in the Sahel, people in the region should be grateful. That is very ridiculous, because over the years that followed Operation Sahel, then was Operation Barkhane, and then there was the G5 Sahel, all of these French-led operations. Under these operations for the 10-year period before they started kicking them out, what you would find was a consistent decline in the security situation in Sahel. So much so that Burkina Faso lost 40% of its territory to jihadists. How can a Burkinabe person look to France and say, yes, thank you? Of course, it is not the primary responsibility of the French army to defend the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. But if you are going to establish yourself as the preferred security partner, then you better be up to the task. And that was not the case at all. Not in Mali, not in Burkina Faso, not in Niger. So it is really disconnected from reality. And I don't think it's something that can just be glossed over. This is a very serious statement. And it's good that Sonko, the current Prime Minister of Senegal, came out very strongly against it and even said, what about the thank you to Africans who served under the French banner flag during World War II? No thank you, no even acknowledgement.
But I'll tell you, though, as somebody who used to run a French newsroom and lived for a long time in France and spends a lot of time in the French media today, I think Emmanuel Macron was speaking to domestic audiences back home who firmly believe this. And I think that the French worldview on this is not very different than what the president articulated. So while it's offensive to Africans, I think it resonates back home in France. And I think there's still quite a bit of that thinking there. Now, at the same time, Ovigwe, you pointed out that all of this is happening just 2 weeks before President-elect Donald Trump takes power again in Washington. And Cobus, this is very interesting because in the run-up to President-elect Trump coming back to the White House, he's been on a tear for the past few weeks. And again, this is relevant for our discussion about Wang Yi because we never thought that this would probably be the case. But we are back in an era of talking about outright bald-faced imperialism, where the United States is talking about acquiring territories in Europe and Latin America through economic coercion and military force. Let's take a listen to some of the remarks from President-elect Donald Trump at his press conference in Mar-a-Lago earlier this week.
Can you assure the world that as you try to get control of these areas, you are not going to use military or economic coercion?
No.
What is the strategy?
Yeah. I can't assure you. You're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this. We need them for economic security. It might be that you'll have to do something. Look, the Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China. And we gave the Panama Canal to Panama. We didn't give it to China. And they've abused it. They've abused that gift. It should have never been made, by the way. Giving the Panama Canal is why Jimmy Carter lost the election, in my opinion.
Your position is clear, but have you directed your staff to take specific actions to drop plans? And can you elaborate again? You didn't rule out military coercion.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time.
And just to be clear here, the Chinese are not operating the Panama Canal. Also, there are no Chinese soldiers deployed to the Panama Canal, as the president-elect has suggested previously. But Cobus, this is all happening in this context where, again, a very prominent theme of the Chinese when they go to Africa and talk about Africa is colonialism and imperialism, that they too were the same. They were victims of the same people who colonized Africa. And I mean, the Chinese have not said anything in response to these remarks by President-elect Trump, but you have to think that this is playing very well into their hand in terms of their positioning and their narrative by saying the West and listening to the remarks of Macron and now Trump are very much not aligned with the countries in Africa and elsewhere that were the victims of imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah, absolutely. What struck me as very funny was if you want to see a kind of a revealing demonstration of Africa's kind of position in the world system, it was very interesting for me how even as the Europeans were in outrage that Trump was saying this about Greenland, they were saying it to Africa. You know, so that was very funny for me. Just the way that those things overlapped was very revealing. I think with all due respect to the Democrats in the US, this is Joe Biden's making. The coddling of Israel's actions in Gaza and the way that has been, like in rhetoric, has been completely, has not been put into the same context as Russia's actions in Ukraine, has created this kind of split in the language of the liberal international system, which has significantly weakened it. And I think where we are now is this kind of saying the quiet part out loud kind of situation, kind of where suddenly it's okay to talk in these very explicitly imperialist terms. I mean, what's going to be very interesting is to see how the global south responds and, kind of how, like what kind of measures they could take, because, the global south is weak, but they have power in their own ways. So this is going to be very interesting.
Well, I think for a lot of people, they're just thinking that this is just bluster and rhetoric, and that the reality of the United States deploying troops to a NATO ally in Greenland, which is under the auspices of Denmark, is implausible at this point. But again, we're in a time where who knows what's going to happen. Okay, well, let's just round out, a rhetorical tour around the world in Beijing with the Chinese foreign ministry. And by the way, there's a new foreign ministry spokesperson, Guo Jiakun, who just started this week. So it's the first time that we've heard from him. He was asked a staged question by CCTV. What I mean by a staged question is that the question is arranged. It's not an authentic question. And you can tell it's not an authentic question because the translator who is translating it is reading a script. And you'll hear Guo's response, and then you'll hear from the translator. But nonetheless, there were some interesting points that he made in his remarks about Wang's tour. And then this will kick off our discussion to get deeper into what he accomplished on this four-nation tour. Let's listen to some remarks by Guo Jiakun.
China is the world's largest developing country, and Africa is the continent home to the largest number of developing countries. China and Africa share time-honored friendship. The fine tradition for Chinese foreign ministers to start their year-round overseas visits with a trip to Africa speaks to the growing profound friendship between China and Africa and the consistency of China's friendly cooperation with Africa. China always believes that Africa has never been the lost continent, but the land of vibrancy and next horizon of development.
Ovigwe, that is the official talking points from Beijing. Very different rhetoric than what we've heard from the United States and from France, certainly, about the global South. When you hear that rhetoric and you hear these contrasting positions, as somebody who studies this from Abuja, what's your take on it?
First of all, I think the one thing from the statements coming from Beijing is that it's very consistent. I think that's something you have to give the Chinese credit for in their diplomatic engagement. Once the messaging is set, everybody goes along with it year in, year out. Whether or not one agrees with the totality of it or the views, that's just how it is. But in contrast with the United States, you always cannot understand what exactly is the mindset. You have to always wait for the administration. And now there is a lot of concern with Trump. Already there was a lot of concern with Trump coming into office and all of what we're saying from Europe as well. But even with the current statements, you compare what Biden would say, for instance, about law, international order, blah, blah, blah. Whether you believe it or not, the Democrats are very consistent in their messaging. But the US is not always ruled by a Democrat. So you have the Republicans to come and example people like Trump who will just say the complete opposite. So it is quite a challenge trying to always predict at least the messaging coming from the US if you take it in totality, all the administrations. And it's not something that is disappointing, I would say, but that's just how politics is. With Europe, attitudes are changing, or rather, messaging is changing, but attitude is not changing, right? So prior to the Ukraine war, there was a lot of the same, or Africa has, we have to work with Africa on migration on this. They don't want to really focus on the issues. And then after the Ukraine was seeing how much Europe does not have any much influence on the continent, then we started seeing Meloni organizing her summit and really trying to drive home a different message in that it's not just about migration, it's not just about Sahel security. We see Africa as an opportunity. So I think this is a world we live in now where by the established systems and way of looking at certain parts of the world is changing and leaders are just trying to play catch-up. But for some partners, there's a lot of consistency. So it depends on African leaders now to then choose what they want to believe.
Talking about that, though, on what the African leader would like to believe, you mentioned the consistency of China, and we see that in the messaging, we see that in the engagement. You also mentioned the fact that now with Trump back in the White House, we're having that sense of uncertainty now creeping into the relationship. First of all, creeping into the U.S. relationship with the rest of the world, but also how the U.S. is going to engage with China. We've seen and we've heard the rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump, how it's going to be very much bullish and really anti-China in its rhetoric. But at the same time, we also heard report that, they've been talking a lot with Xi Jinping, trying really to have a good relation and trying to work together. We have all those contradictions happening. So when you see now all those lack of clarity into the US, the new administration and the China consistency relationship with Africa, how do you see that uncertainty playing in Africa and how African countries should be related to that uncertainty between the US and China? So far, we still don't know how it's going to play out. but how Africa should approach that period of uncertainty that's coming our way.
So the way I look at it is we have to, again, zoom out. And if you see there is a trend in the world, before we look at messaging, attitudes around global politics is changing. We are seeing a decline in liberal international order, which is very, very good with nine stock. This is the Bidens, the Obamas kind of language, trying to really appeal to people with very flowery kind of language. I mean, every country, or really most of the great power, they do it, but it's really is the hallmark of the liberal international system. But now what we're seeing is, you could say in many ways, a rise of Realpolitik, very clear, harsh, sharp kind of messaging. This is what I want to do, might make right, etc., etc. So we're seeing that with Trump, we're seeing that with Orban, we're seeing that with even Meloni, for instance. I mean, she's getting closer to the Atlantic side now, but before last year, you could say she was part of this, this as well. So in the West, the messaging is getting sharper, particularly for some leaders. Even parties that are rising in Europe today, they are of this extraction as well. AfD in Germany, or you're looking at the Freedom Party in Austria, Reform in the UK, like that. So African leaders have to understand that in the so-called West or collective West, there is a huge change in what is mainstream. What used to be mainstream is no longer dominant. We now have at least two approaches to the world where you Realpolitik with this coarse and harsh language, and then you have some of these leaders as well who try to give that kind of messaging. So if I'm an African leader, for instance, knowing that this is the way the world is going to be, forget about messaging. You have to look at action. And this is 101 in politics. It doesn't matter what the person says. What matters at the end of the day is what is being done on the ground. And if we contrast that from, say, maybe an infrastructure perspective, there is a lot of talk on infrastructure from the Western country with PGI, with Global Gateway, and not much action. But there have been action on areas where there's core strategic interest for the West. For instance, in digital technologies and subsea cables, in critical mineral supply chain, they're moving really, really fast. So, but that is just how it is, because that aligns with interest. So forget about what you're hearing, judge your interests, try to get a clear understanding of your counterpart's interests. Where there's an alignment, you'll find out that you can move things faster. It doesn't matter what Trump says, it's what he's really going to do at the end of the day. I think that's what is really important.
So beyond the remarks from Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and the tour by Wang Yi, there was a lot of other things going on around the China Global South space. Just want to take a very short break to touch base with our news editor in Nairobi, Njenga Hakina, who's been following all of the different stories that we've been covering over on the China Global South Project website. Let's check in now with Njenga for an update.
Thanks, Eric. Nairobi is sizzling, but we first head to Indonesia to meet the forest keepers affected by nickel smelting, which is threatening their indigenous way of life. We've got a very stunning photo essay on the website. The photos are breathtaking, despite the reality of what is happening in this region in Indonesia. Here in Nairobi, Chinese EV tech is transforming mobility in Kenya, and as Chinese car brands steadily make their way into the African market, their advancements in electric vehicle technology are also jump-starting another innovation that can only be found on this side of the world. We have a fantastic story on YouTube and on the website, which you definitely will enjoy. And Eric did this very fascinating analysis of a Chinese scholar's academic paper on US-China competition in Africa's development finance space. Be sure to check that out as well. The year is still very new and there is much more coming your way. But in the meantime, back to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Njenga. And I just want to give a shout out to Njenga and the great work that he did this week on this Chinese EV tech being used in Kenya to retrofit cars, internal combustion engine cars. We've got a great video and a great story, and it is amazing, and it's doing really well over on our YouTube channel. So cannot recommend enough for you to check it out, and all of the other stories that Njenga talked about that we worked on this week. Plus, we've got a great column from Géraud talking about the visit and laying out what was the key thing. Géraud, part of the research that you did into this visit was you went back to 1991, looked at all 35 years of the trips that the Chinese foreign minister has made at the beginning of the year, this tradition that we've been talking about, this consistency. What was some of the trends that you found looking back over the past 35 years? Where did they go? What were some of the patterns? What can you discern from the data of these past 35 years?
Yes, I was really trying to understand if there was a way either to predict the next trip or to understand if there is any kind of logic behind the choice they make by picking those countries. And I went, as you say, I really dug back into the 35 years of history to really try to see those countries visited. So out of the 54 African countries, 53 have been visited. As we can expect, a country like Eswatini didn't receive any visit because Eswatini is the only one in Africa that has a relationship with Taiwan as a country. Somalia also did not get a visit. Somalia did not get a visit. But when you look at the map, you realize that Northern Africa, the Mali, the Algeria, the Mauritania only get like 1 or 2 visits. And the most visited country, interestingly, is Ovigwe's country, is Nigeria. Nigeria got 7 visits all in the next 35 years. And when you look at the date, you really see close date, like within 5 years apart, 5 years apart, 4, 6 years apart. Whereas many countries have been, you have to wait like, 10 years, 15 years. Nigeria and South Africa really had those closeness in terms of visits. South Africa is like 5 visits as well. But out of the 5 visits, you really see like every 3-4 years, every 4 years and every 6 years, you have those visits happening a lot. And I was expecting to see a country like Angola having 6 or 7. Angola has only 3 visits. And mind you, when you look at the date, the first one was 2001. The second one was 2018, 17 years after that. 17 years after we had like the Angola model, we had the loans, we had all those billions of dollars put into Angola's economy. But in terms of visit, like the traditional visit, you only get like 3 of them and 17 years apart. That just tells you that sometimes there's not really clear economical or geopolitical logic behind the way they approach those visits, but it was really interesting. And we've put the map on our website where you can really find country visited, the years they've been visited, and also see the foreign affairs minister was during those visits. We're gonna keep on digging into those numbers to try to find maybe there is a logic behind it, but I really doubt that we're gonna find a clear pattern or a clear algorithm behind the choice they make during those visits.
Yeah, Cobus, every year at this time of year, the 3 of us get a lot of requests from media to do interviews and to provide some context about these visits. And this year was no exception. And we spoke to Reuters and Deutsche Welle and the Voice of America and any number of media outlets. And the same question always keeps coming back. And you spoke to some journalists about this as well. Why are they going to the certain countries that they're going to? So why did Wang Yi choose Chad, Congo, and Nigeria and Namibia? Now, the Republic of Congo makes sense that he went there because they are now the co-chair of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation gathering that's going to take place 3 years from now, or 2 years from now, 2027, 2.5 years. But in terms of Chad and Namibia and Nigeria, I mean, we can assign all sorts of different strategic reasons. Namibia has uranium. Nigeria has this incredibly important market and this geopolitical relationship. Chad is part of the Sahel amid declining French influence. We can assign all of those reasons. But at the end of the day, I mean, we have to be painfully honest. We have no idea. We have no insight whatsoever as to what motivates them to go to these countries.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe 2 things are at play. So I was thinking, as Géraud was talking about Angola, is that maybe shows that these kind of trips and FOCAC itself is one level of Chinese engagement with Africa, and bilateral engagement, of course, is a different one. And a lot of those kind of very specific things that were achieved in the China-Angola relationship happened on the bilateral level. So there's one difference. I guess the other thing, maybe more abstract one, is that it seems to be that part of the logic behind it is to directly present China as a different actor than the ones that Africa is used to, and particularly to step away from this logic that I think is very strong in Western foreign policy, that certain countries are pivotal keystone countries and other ones are not as important, right? Kind of, so for the US, for example, France is important, Greece less important, right? So there's an entire logic behind those kind of calculations, which maybe the Chinese are signaling that they're not following, that they're busy with something else. So there is an almost like a, wheel of fortune aspect to it, where there's, if they kind of just spin a wheel, but there's also an aspect where they seem to be very much led by balancing regions, balancing big and small, balancing prominent and not prominent, just being, it's almost as if Africa is in a queue, and they just kind of, everyone in the queue gets to meet with Wang Yi at some stage, rather than some people being more important than others.
So if, for example, he spent a lot of time in Central Africa this time, we can assume that next year he won't spend as much time in Central Africa. He may be in Southern Africa or Eastern Africa. And they do strive for that geographic balance. And one of the other hallmarks of this trips is that there is, Cobus, as you pointed out, this mix of small and large pivotal, non-pivotal states that are always there. So we have, again, Nigeria and Chad in terms of size. Chad doesn't usually get foreign minister visits from P5 Security Council members, and so the Chinese do that. Now, we talked about the fact at the beginning of the show there were not a lot of big announcements. This was a very low-key trip, but there was one major headline that did come out of the trip in Nigeria, a $255 million loan from the China Development Bank for the Kaduna to Kano Railway Project. This is a $973 million project that has been frozen for many years, in part because of funding delays from the Chinese. So it was a little bit of a surprise that the Chinese are getting back into the railway financing business in Nigeria. This is something that, again, has been a point of contention in Nigeria for many years, as they've had very ambitious standard gauge railway ambitions, but at the same time, they've been hard to get going because of a lack of financing. This particular railway is a 203-kilometer SGR that goes from Kaduna to Kano. Were you surprised, Ovigwe, when you saw the news of this China Development Bank loan, given the fact that loans from China for railway projects in Nigeria have been far and few between over the past, say, 5 or 6 years?
No, and I would say that because one, if you look at the engagement since President Tinubu came into office, it has actually been very, very high. First, there was the foreign minister going for the Belt and Road Forum. Then we had the state visit by President Tinubu and the appointment of the Director General Tegbe to lead the China-Nigeria strategic partnership. One of the interesting things with China-Nigeria relationship under President Tinubu is that is actually been not just necessarily be a continuation, but there's actually an increase. And this is not something that a lot of people expected, because President Tinubu is seen as being more interested in engaging with the West, but that's actually not true. President Tinubu, for instance, was a governor of Lagos State when we saw the period where we saw a huge engagement and investment coming from China, and Lagos being the economic hub of Nigeria. So he is very, very familiar with working with the Chinese, from having that experience at the subnational level or state level, as we call it in Nigeria, before becoming president. So it's not new in that regard. So the second thing is because, of course, being in Nigeria, being in Abuja, and just a late part of last year, our CEO, actually visited Abuja and met with the Director General himself, Mr. Tegbe. And during that conversation, you could see there's a lot of enthusiasm and optimism, not the kind where it is, we are hoping to get this. No, it's the kind that we have certain things that are close. Of course, it wasn't explicit. Nobody, and even when she was at the foreign ministry as well, too, from those engagements, we already could sense, even though they were not being upfront, we could sense that there is a tightening of the relationship. So even with the announcement that he'll be going to Nigeria, that wasn't a surprise to me, just by seeing from those visits that Development Reimagined made, and also from my own contact, talking to people and saying that, yes, Nigeria wants to actually work on projects with China and prioritizing ongoing large-scale infrastructure projects. Like, for instance, the Abuja-Kaduna section was completed in 2016. We've not completed any of the other sections. You recall, and I know this is a project you know very well, and China Global South knows very well, that is a long project. It starts from Lagos all the way to Kano. So we've done the Abuja-Kaduna section. Now, financing has been stopped for other sections, but now we're not seeing movement. And I think President Tinubu has prioritized this as one of the flagship projects he wants to use to symbolize his presidency.
Well, let's take that into account when we kind of look ahead now to what's coming in China-Africa relations for 2025. This is something, again, that you focus on quite a bit, Ovigwe. So when you look back at the visit that took place this week and you see where we are in the geopolitical environment that we talked about earlier in the program, what's your forecast for 2025 in terms of Chinese engagement in Africa? What are you expecting, and what are you and the team at Development Reimagined talking about with your clients and partners?
So I will just go over it from looking at sectors. I think it is very, very clear from anyone following China-Africa relations that energy is a big issue, but it's going to be front and center. And that is, when I mean energy now, we're looking both traditional hydrocarbons renewable energy, those kind of investment, but also tying that to green development. If you recall, the 9th article on the list of 10 in the Beijing Action Plan has green development as being a priority. And there will be a lot of movement in that direction because it ties to even another action plan, which is the Industrial Chain Cooperation. Knowing fully well that with Trump's administration, pressure is going to build on China. And of course, I'm trying to invest in certain areas in Africa, more, at least prioritizing those investments to offset any loss that would be coming in their engagement with United States, possibly even Europe. So if Africa can be to CATL, BYD, what Africa was to Transsion, the Chinese will be very, very happy. You understand? Because if you remember, Transsion was a small company and then it came to Africa and just became a unicorn in a very short period of time. Why? Because we already had African countries could absorb that because there was already investment in telecommunications. So cell phone penetration became easier. Their Chinese phones are competitive, and then of course Africans can buy those phones. They already have cell towers to operate them. But the problem with electric vehicles or new energy vehicles is that there is no base load to charge those vehicles, right? So the energy poverty makes it difficult for China to say, okay, if we can't export BYD to Europe, let's export to Africa, right? Let's open up Africa. You can't open up the continent like that because people can charge. Even if you can sell the cars and they can manage the roads, the infrastructure is just not there. The cell towers, the 3G, the 2G component that Africa has already built before Transsion came, we do not have that in terms of energy infrastructure. The continent still has that energy poverty. So that is why going forward, I see there will be a lot of emphasis on trying to build up the energy base on the continent, particularly in markets that are ripe or near ripe. Like even Southern Africa, the electricity situation in Southern Africa is probably the best next to North Africa and in East Africa, right? So these markets, Ethiopia, South Africa, we just saw news regarding EVs from South Africa recently that will be facilitating Chinese investment in EV sector. Namibia, for instance, Botswana, these countries that have good energy access compared to other parts of the continent, and won't be surprised if we're seeing more action there to try to build up, so that as we're seeing those tariffs being slapped on Chinese vehicles, BYD and the likes, they'll be able to offset those with the African continent. That's one. The second and lastly, I also think the issue of infrastructure development and finance is still going to be prioritized because it still remains part of the commitment, at least in the messaging we're hearing from China. Yeah, it might not be those multi-billion-dollar investments. The money might not come as quickly as they used to, but that is still going to be part of the conversation because whether we like it or not, apart from the fact that the need is there and there's common understanding with both sides, those set of projects make China-Africa relationship look very, very good. And it might be more difficult for the Chinese to do, it might be more painful for them to do it now than it was, or more difficult to do it, to this type of investment, but it would add to the political messaging, to bolster the political messaging, it would be good for the continent, and again, it would be good for them to also get those exports demand from the continent, right? So I think those are the two main ones I want to highlight.
Okay, those are good things to keep an eye on. By the way, we're doing a lot of EV coverage with Njenga, as you heard in the mid-show break there. So we'll be talking a lot about Chinese EVs in Africa. Ovigwe, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights on so many different issues. We really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure and so insightful to have you on the program. Ovigwe Eguegu is a policy analyst for Development Reimagined based in Abuja, Nigeria, and he's been following Wang Yi's trip all this week very closely. Ovigwe, thank you again for your time.
Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure speaking to you and the team.
Always a pleasure to have Ovigwe back on the show again. He has such a wealth of knowledge in covering this space. I'm going to differ with him a little bit. I'd like to get your take on this. I don't think the Chinese are going to come in heavy in the infrastructure financing space in Africa. I was surprised by the $255 million loan to Nigeria. Again, that's just my take. Just because the amount of lending that the Chinese have done, particularly in large-scale infrastructure, has gone down. I don't know how this project fits into the small and beautiful dynamic. Maybe $255 million is considered small. We always worked on the assumption that it was going to be somewhere below $50 million and going to be more aligned with tech and have very strong environmental components. So I don't see how this project fits into that. But I just want to bring your attention to the increasingly downbeat news coming out of the Chinese economy that the bond yields have plunged to their lowest level on record. And there's growing concerns that China is now entering a phase of what people are calling Japanification, which is this persistent deflation. And there's this economic malaise that's really just pulling down the economy. And that is going to be the major focus for President Xi this year and going forward until he can get this economy turned around. So long as that's the case, it is not going to be popular at all for Xi to start extending massive loans into infrastructure into Africa and elsewhere in the global south. The economy in China is bad and getting worse. This is not to suggest that the economy is better anywhere else. We have a difficult economy in many parts of the world, but the data that we're starting to see coming out of China for the past 12 months is not encouraging. And I think this is going to have a profound effect on their ability to extend large-scale, multi-billion-dollar loan packages to places in Africa. Cobus, let's get your take on that first, and then we'll move on to some other issues before we go.
I think that's true, but I do think it's particularly true for state-backed loans and anything that happens under the rubric of aid. It becomes, I think, a little bit more of a complicated situation when one talks about different kinds of public-private kind of partnerships and the way that through these partnerships, sometimes, the lending can be routed through these partnerships in order to avoid some of these perceptions. So I'm interested to see whether there'll be a way, because it benefits Chinese companies, whether there's a way of putting it on the kind of economic growth side of the ledger, and whether there's, whether either on the African side or the Chinese side or together, that there's these kind of like not creative accounting in that sense, but like the, kind of different ways of kind of phrasing it and putting it that would allow a certain amount of this lending to continue. Because as Ovigwe was pointing out, once one overcomes, in the first place, China can make a lot of money by overcoming some of the energy problems in Africa, and those don't need to be kind of railway style massive loans. It's something like a electricity distribution network in a medium-sized city, for example. So it could be broken up into smaller projects. And once there's more of a critical mass of that stuff, then the amount of Chinese stuff, like actual exports that could be sold in that market, increases exponentially. So there is definitely some incentives for China there to find ways of spending the money. I'm interested in whether it's politically possible for them to do so.
Okay. Very quickly, because we're running out of time, Géraud, I want to touch on a couple of things that you covered on your beat looking at Francophone Africa, and particularly in your country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There were two stories that caught my attention this week that I know you covered. One was a Congolese police officer apparently opened fire and killed two Chinese workers who were on a road project. And then there was a protest in South Kivu province against illegal mining that focused on a lot of what the Chinese are doing. Chinese illegal miners, I should be very specific there. Give us a little bit of an update on what's going on in the Congo.
So basically what happened in South Kivu, in the eastern part of the DRC, is the fact that the civil society has been voicing the concern about Chinese presence in the illegal mining, gold mining in the eastern part of the DRC. So mid-December, we had an arrest of 17 Chinese who were arrested. And 2 days later, first they were released and exfiltrated to China by the immigration police. And there was a lot of commotion about that, people talking why the immigration police released them. And the governor of South Kivu basically was saying that there are many people in Kinshasa being in high level that are complicit behind those illegal mining operations with the Chinese. That's why the Chinese were released after that. And a few days later, 3 Chinese were arrested. And the same thing somehow starting to unfold again, where we have what we had interference coming from Kinshasa. So people are suspecting that some powerful people in Kinshasa are really trying to protect those Chinese. So we have that dynamic happening in the illegal gold mining operation, where we've been covering that for so many years that we've talked about it, where this situation is only happening because you have powerful people, politicians and the decision makers and the army officers that are protecting and are using those Chinese to do those illegal mining operations. That's why they're protected. That's why they keep fleeing the country, and when situations like this happen. Yeah.
But before we move on to this next story, I want to bring everybody back. When you talk about powerful people, you're not insinuating that the Chinese embassy in Kinshasa is part of this, because if I recall, remember former Chinese ambassador Zhu Jing, when he was the envoy in Kinshasa, sent a very stern warning to Chinese illegal miners in both North Kivu and South Kivu in the eastern DRC to say, get out, or else if you don't get out, you're not going to be under our jurisdiction in any way, and we're not going to help you. And we're kind of fed up with the illegal mining. And so I don't know if the embassy actually means anything by that, but at the end of the day, the embassy itself has communicated repeatedly that it doesn't want to have anything to do with this.
And the embassy is also sometimes very powerless in that situation, because I remember when I mentioned some informal conversation with certain diplomats here, they've been telling you, you know what, people are asking us to do something, but we cannot do anything against those Chinese who are free citizens to do whatever they do in the DRC, but we cannot do anything when those same Chinese are protected by powerful people in your countries. You want us to act, but they're telling us, we have this person with us. We have this general protecting us. So what do you want us to do? So sometimes, and in this case, for example, the Chinese embassies and diplomats, sometimes they're just powerless to act against Chinese that are protected by powerful people in Kinshasa.
Yeah. And it's funny that this question of deporting Chinese criminals and without making them actually pay anything and to do the sentence in the DRC, I mean, from my understanding is being sent to prison in the DRC is the third layer of hell. And I mean, if you really want to do a deterrent for people, is to send them to jail and to prison for long sentences and then showcase what their life is like in a DRC jail and then send that back to China. That to me feels like that is commensurate with the risk that they're taking. But very quickly, you also said that civil society groups are protesting the Chinese. There was a question of some gold bars that were found as well, correct?
Yeah, and some gold bars were found, and now there's even controversy around how many gold bars were seized, how much money was seized, because we heard that they seized $800,000, now it's $400,000. Now Kinshasa is intervening to try asking the governor to make sure that the money is counted and it's really $800,000 and how many gold bars. All of that just telling you the mess that surrounds this illegal gold mining operation, where you have a lot of powerful people behind, and no one really among those people want the truth to come out. That's why you have that situation. I can bet you that in few days, those Chinese will be released and business will keep on moving as usual.
Cobus, the story that Géraud is telling us about what's happening in the DR Congo is almost word for word exactly the same thing as what we heard in Ghana with the Galamsey and the illegal mining there. That at the end of the day, it was the landowners, the chiefs, and the people in power who are facilitating the illegal mining. And they were using, in many respects, the Chinese as facilitators to execute the illegal mining. And let's be very clear, the Chinese are one of a number of foreign nationals groups who are operating in Ghana. Nigerians, Malians, and others are also operating in the illegal mining sector there. But it comes down to, where does accountability lie? A lot of people will focus attention on the Chinese and these Chinese miners, but at the end of the day, it seems like it would be the responsibility of the state government to enforce its own laws and to not engage in this type of corrupt activity. And that feels where the accountability must lie first, before looking at the foreigners who are operating in these countries. Where do you come down on that accountability question?
Yeah, I really agree. You see the same dynamics in so many different African scandals that have to do with different groups of foreigners, not only even Chinese. So, for example, in South Africa, there's been a huge moral panic because of little convenience stores that are run by Somalis and Ethiopians in South African townships that sold, in one case or few cases, sold, substandard food to kids, and then a few of those children actually ended up dying. And so it was a very, very kind of hot outrage in South Africa. And of course, then the Ethiopian and Somalian communities were immediately blamed, not the South African officials who everyone knows were helping to facilitate the situation. And we see exactly the same thing in relation to logging, for example, Chinese illegal logging in Central Africa as well. We've covered that numerous times. Recently, Géraud and I were interviewing, authors of the newest report on the same situation, where frequently it's illegal logging, but it's happening under legal license because a corrupt official just issued that license for payment. So it happens so often, and it's one of the biggest, kind of governance problems in Africa, I think.
Okay, well, let's leave our discussion there for the week. We covered, again, a wide range of topics this week. Always a fascinating discussion with the three of you, and we're grateful to Ovigwe for joining us. If you would like to join our discussion on what China's doing in Africa, but also out here in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Central Asia, we are doing I gotta say, I'm just so proud of the work that's being done now by Géraud and Cobus and Njenga and Johnny and Edwin and Lucy and the team. We have a team around the world who's focusing on this. We are really the only source that does this kind of work. The analysis that Géraud did, for example, on the trips, looking back to 1991, that's the only place in the world that you're ever going to find that kind of insight. And if you want to support this kind of independent journalism and you really want to better understand what's happening in an agenda-free, fact-based context, then this is the source that you need to follow. And again, I say this just out of pride for the great work that they're doing. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable, and you'll get access to all of our archives of more than 5,000 stories, our podcast transcripts. You get unique insights and exclusive insights from the team. Plus, you'll get the daily email newsletter that Cobus puts together, and it is just fantastic. And so once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or a teacher, we're going to give you half off. Just email me directly, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for the half off discount. So for Géraud in Mauritius and Cobus in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. We're all going to be back next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Bluesky and X at China GS Project, or on YouTube at China Global South, and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.